Okay, so today we're going to be talking about solving linear equations and inequalities. And I think the big thing is that you can do certain things to help you solve equations. And mostly we're using inverses. And so one thing, as I shift in my chair, one thing you can do is you're allowed to add any two equations together. You're allowed to subtract any equations. You're allowed to multiply two equations together. And so those are the principles that we would use, as well as inverses. And so as we're doing these questions today, I think the big thing is, if you're solving an equation, 2x plus 3 equals, say, 8, what you're really doing is you're adding these two equations together. Negative 3 equals negative 3. It's a boring equation. But yes, you're saying you're adding negative 3 to both sides of the equation, but you're really adding two equations together, and the resultant equation is also true. You can add any two equations together, including like y equals mx plus b, with 5 equals 5. You could add 5 to both sides and you would get a true equation. It's not very helpful. So that's kind of part of it too, is like you're allowed to do that, but what would help you solve your equation? And so as you're solving these questions on this sheet, you'll see some basic problems, like, okay, well, that's minus 5 from both sides. You're really just adding the equation negative 5 equals negative 5 to the other equation, but it doesn't necessarily mean, you don't have to necessarily think about that each time you work. And so if you divide both sides by negative 1.6, you're going to get r is equal to 8. And so that's the value that will make it true. Also on part B, we are looking to solve that equation. And I think the big thing is you can distribute 1/3, and sometimes you will, to both those parentheses. But sometimes you're like, well, that's going to make lots of fractions. So the question is, what would help you? Well, if you multiply both sides, all the terms of the equation by 3, that's going to help you to be able to do this. And so the thing is to be careful. Okay, when you're looking at this equation, this first term is really this whole group here. And so with this whole group, you don't distribute it to the coefficient or the leading value in front of the parentheses that's supposed to, and the parentheses. That'd be too much. That would not be true. You can either do it to the coefficient in front of the parentheses, or you can do it to both terms within it. So you can make a choice. And in my opinion, if you're timesing all the terms by 3, I would pick the leading value up front of that as well as this number right here. So every term or group, that group has to be distributed by 3. And so that would be 1/3 times 3 is 1. You times it by 3 or 3 over 1. So you get 2x minus 57 and then plus, and then 1 times that would be just 6 minus x. And then that equals negative 12. Combining like terms gives you x. It looks like minus 51 is equal to negative 12. If you add 51 to both sides, you're going to get x is equal to 39. So be careful with your signs, be careful with your inverses, make sure that you combine like terms on the same side. Word problems, honestly, at this level, they're not going to be terrible. He had made 28 points, and then he did some 2-point shots, so 2x, and total to get 100 points. If you solve that by minusing 28 from both sides and divide by 2, x is equal to 36 goals. So nothing really outstandingly shocking, I believe, on side 1, except remember how to deal with fractions. To solve literal equations, okay, you'll use this when you're not going to actually get a numerical answer. You're just trying to rearrange the equation. You're going to do that a lot in different courses, especially chemistry or science courses. But solving this for L, that's this value on the right-hand side. Okay, so if we're trying to solve for L, what we're trying to do is we're saying we got to isolate that. And so isolate it by moving the other terms to the other side by adding or subtracting. So we minus 2w from both sides. You get p minus 2w equals 2l. And then to get L by itself, divide by 2. Now, the thing is you can either divide each term by 2, okay? Then you get a half p minus 1w. Or you can put the whole thing over 2. What you cannot do is cancel out the 2, because there are 3 different terms, 2 on the top and 1 on the bottom. And unless something goes into all 3 terms, you cannot cancel it out. Okay, so a lot of kids are like, oh, I'm going to do 5 plus 1 over 5 and cancel all the 5s. I'm like, nah. There are 3 different terms. Nothing goes into all 3 terms. So therefore, your answer is going to be 6/5. You cannot just cross out the 5 and say, hey, the answer is 1. Okay, what you can do is if it was 5 times W over 5, that's just one term over one term, and 5 goes into both those terms. So therefore you would have W. Okay, so be careful using, like what do you have going on here? Okay, the next one, solving this. You're like, I got to get to Y2. You're like, how do I get there? There's a lot of different steps. Well, you can cross multiply. Put this over 1, and you can diagonally multiply 1 times Y2 minus Y1 and set that equal to M times X2 minus X1. And then we want to solve for Y2, right? And so if you distribute the 1 here, well, that doesn't change it. So if you want to get Y2 by itself, well, then just add Y1 to both sides. And so your answer would be Y2 equals Y1 plus, and then you'd have M, and then X2 minus X1. You can choose to distribute that, but the terms won't combine anyway, so it doesn't necessarily matter on that. Okay, so when we're talking about different notations in the previous chapter, if you can recall, we talked about, hey, set builder is, instead of listing out a set, you would actually just say, well, tell the members that are allowed to be in the set. Okay, and so you would say the members of the set shalt be, okay, thou shalt be greater than or equal to 3. And so how you would graph that is like just graph the values that are greater than or equal to 3. So at 3, you make a solid dot and you graph values that are going to be greater than 3. If you did interval notation, you would say starting with 3, go to infinity. And so with this picture here, if you want to do set builder, you would do, okay, X is such that X is going to be less than 2. And you would say, okay, great. And then the interval notation would be from negative infinity until 2, but it would be an open circle at 2. So it would be just a 2. And so remember, if you've got less than or greater than, it's an open circle. It doesn't include that value. If it's greater than or equal to or less than or equal to that value, it can be that value or higher or lower, depending what they're asking you to do. And so if you divide or multiply both sides by negative, it flips the way the inequality faces, and then also put your answer in standard form. So if you get 5 is greater than X, well, rewrite it. Put X is less than 5. Make it, it's the M&M machine is going towards the 5, so make sure it stays towards the 5. So always put your answer in proper form. Also, if you divide both sides by negative, or multiply both sides by negative, it changes who's bigger. Because in the world of positives, 5 is bigger than 2, but in the world of negatives, negative 2 is bigger than negative 5. Okay, so that's why when you divide both sides by negative or multiply both sides by negative, you've got to flip it. Okay, so let's wrap up the rest of these little notes. If you're solving this inequality here, you would multiply both sides by 2. And so 4x minus 3 is greater than negative 7. Add 3 to both sides and divide by 4. You would get x is going to be greater than negative 1. Okay, so you'd make an open circle at negative 1 and shade to the right. So add 3 to both sides, divide by 4. Because you're dividing both sides by a positive 4, you don't switch the way the inequality faces. On the next one, if you distribute this out, you're going to get negative 2x plus 6 is less than or equal to, 8x minus 16 plus 2, combining like terms and bringing everything to the same side. I would minus 8x, so you'd get negative 10x. I would subtract 6, and so you would get negative 20. Dividing both sides by negative 10 causes you to get x is greater than or equal to positive 2. Okay, dividing both sides by negative makes positive. So you would graph a solid circle at 2 and shade it to the right. If you solved it so the x is on the other side, you would not end up dividing by negative. You would end up with something that would say 2 is going to be this. And so you just would rewrite it to get to this final answer. Make sure it remains the same, meaning it goes towards the letter or the number it is when you rewrite it in proper form with the letter on the left and the number on the right. Okay, the last one. 2 things that have to be added together to have to stay less than 300 pounds. It says cannot be more than that. So it looks like it can be equal to it. And then the next thing would be if you solve that, plugging in x is 175 for x or y, doesn't matter. You're going to get x is going to be less than 125 pounds, less than or equal to, it looks like. So that would be your answer for this. Thank you so much. Have a good day.